Good morning and welcome to the latest edition of our In-House in Focus series by Mills & Reeve. As regular subscribers will know, this is a series of webinars for in-house legal advisors, each focused on a different topic. In this edition, we focus on the government's recent changes to the planning system. What follows is a 30-minute presentation aimed at providing an overview to the recent changes in the planning system for non-property professionals. We start with a bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded today and we are in webinar mode, so you can see and hear us and see our slides, but we can't see or hear you. After the presentation, we should have some time for questions. So please enter any questions that you may have in the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the webinar screen. Questions will be sent to speakers and will be sent through anonymously. So if you would like your name put against your question, then please insert that in the question as well. In addition, at the end of the seminar, as you exit, there's the opportunity to provide feedback and suggest other topics for future sessions, so please help us with that as well. So a little bit about us before we start. I'm Peter Seaborn. I head the planning team at Mills & Reeve, and today I'm joined by Alex Round, a senior associate in our planning team. As a planning team, we have particular specialism in strategic land and large-scale developments. Our team was shortlisted for Planning Team of the Year this year by Planning Magazine, something we're proud of, and was recognised last year for our work on large housing planning permissions. We acted on the largest housing planning permission in the country last year, which was a planning permission relating to a new settlement in Waterbeach, Cambridgeshire. So what is today's topic all about? Well, the Prime Minister has described the current planning system as outdated and ineffective. He likened the system to a house designed and built in 1947, which has been patched up and repaired over the years, but in 2020 is no longer fit for habitation. Now, these were strong words, and given this, it's unsurprising that the reforms proposed by the government are significant. For the purposes of today, we have split the government's plans in three. First, changes that have been made now. These focus on changes to permitted development rights and changes to the use classes order. And this will be the main focus of our presentation. Alex will explain these concepts and the consequences of these changes in his session. But essentially, they allow some development to take place without you having to apply for planning permission, either because the works are not themselves considered to be development or deemed planning permission is granted. The second limb relates to the government's proposals to change the current planning system. These relate to improving the effectiveness of the current system in the short term, pending wider reform. Following that, the third limb relates to longer term changes, and these are the most significant. This relates to the planning for the future white paper, which has received a lot of attention in mainstream press. And this is where the government sets out its plans to undertake its fundamental reform of the planning system. But changes to the planning system are not always straightforward, and key parts of the government's existing changes are the subject of a legal challenge brought by a campaign group called Rights Community Action. They have challenged changes to use classes and permitted development rights in the courts and seek for the statutory instruments containing these changes to be quashed. The case was heard last week and the judgment from the court is awaited. So now Alex is going to explain the existing changes that have been made.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. And as Pete says, I'm going to now spend a little bit of time just providing a high-level overview of some of the changes made to the use classes order and in relation to permitted development rights, both of which have now been in effect for a little over a month. I'm going to start with the use classes order. And just before going on to touch on what's happening with it, it might just be worth having a very brief word on what the use classes order actually does. Some of you might be more familiar with it than others, but essentially the use classes order puts different types of use for buildings and land into categories called classes, use classes. And the significance of a particular use being in any particular use class is that changes of use between uses in the same class are not considered to constitute development and therefore don't require planning permission. Whereas a change of use from a use in one class to a use in another, on the face of it, would require planning permission. And so the changes to the use classes order are all about making it easier for people to change the use of their land or their buildings. And this round of changes really are quite fundamental. They result in huge flexibility being given over to landowners, business owners, developers, etc. And then the other side of that coin is that quite a bit of control has been taken away from local planning authorities. And on both sides of the aisle, there's been quite a bit of excitement about this and what it might all mean. And the main point to make is that there will now be many changes of use that can now happen without planning permission needing to be applied for and without the local planning authority being able to prevent it from happening. There will be some exceptions to that, but that is, generally speaking, what we are talking about. And so why has the government done it? Well, the government says in its explanatory memorandum that these changes are in response to a rapid change in demand for the types of uses found principally on the high street and in our town centres. And it's also billed as part of the pandemic response. But two things are fairly interesting to note. While the changes might have the high street in mind, they nonetheless apply across the entire country, including in out-of-town locations like big retail parks and office parks and things like that. And while the legislation has come through as part of the government's initial pandemic response, there aren't any indications that these are temporary only measures, and I imagine that they will stay with us for a little while after the pandemic. So depending on the size of the screen that you're viewing the webinar on, you may or may not be able to see all of this detail. And if you can't, but would like to, fear not, because these slides will be shared afterwards. But just very briefly, what we have here is a comparison between, if you will, the old money and the new money in terms of what we call these various uses. So some familiar looking things on the left: shops, cafes, restaurants, takeaways, etc. And then in the middle, what use classes these uses previously fell within, and now, as of the 1st of September, the new classes that they fall within. And I'm going to go on to now talk about use class E, which is the headline grabbing, if you will, element to these changes. But you can see that there are a couple of other new classes that have been created, F1 and F2, and certain things that used to be in classes are now described as sui generis, which means they don't belong in any class. So class E. This is, I think, probably the most significant of the new classes, and this is really at the heart of the radicalism in the changes to the use classes order. You've got here on this slide a list of quite varied mixed uses, which previously will have been within a number of different use classes, but are now all brought together in the same list. And so again, the significance of this is that if you are currently using your land or your buildings for any of these things, on the face of it, you will now be able to change the use or have a part use for a mixture of uses for anything in this list. And you can see that there are some fairly big differences here. We could, for example, be talking about going from a gym use to a retail use, or a restaurant use to an office use, or a creche use to a light industrial use, and so on. A huge amount of flexibility is created as a result of this list consolidating these very different uses. So other than lots of flexibility, what does all of this actually mean in practice? Well, that's actually fairly difficult to answer at the moment, because there are, I think, many unanswered questions in the industry at the moment about potential unintended consequences of the changes, and I think time will tell. But these are some of the questions that have immediately come to my mind and to the mind of others. And so the first one, thinking about local planning authorities, how can they retain control over changes of use, if at all? I think in a nutshell, if somebody is looking to change the use of an existing building, then there is fairly little that a local planning authority is likely to be able to do about it, unless perhaps there's an existing planning condition or Section 106 obligation which restricts the use of that building. But on the face of it, very little for an LPA to do. Local planning authorities will, of course, be tasked with granting new planning permissions for future development, and there may be an opportunity to restrict the use classes order by imposing a condition, but only in limited circumstances. Another good question to ask is, well, what should leases now say on the topic of permitted uses? Landlords and tenants alike will be thinking about what these changes mean in terms of how to structure leases and what it all means, for example, when it comes to rent review and so on. From a sort of pure planning point of view, I know many are currently wondering, does this all mean that certain local plan policies that may have been recently adopted are now out of date, ? And similarly with national policy, the NPPF, will that now need to be rewritten, or at least in part, to respond to the changes to the use classes order? There are questions about SIL and what existing charging schedules say, and also questions about how to assess the environmental and retail impact of certain developments. What assumptions should we be making about the use of land or buildings when undertaking those assessments? It's a trickier area now than it was before, I think we can say. The next topic that I'm going to touch on briefly is that of permitted development rights. And whereas before with the use classes order, we were talking about being able to do things that don't need planning permission because those things don't constitute development in the first place, with permitted development rights, we're talking about doing things which do constitute development, and so on the face of it require planning permission, but where through legislation planning permission is already deemed to be granted. So there would no longer be, for example, a requirement to go off and apply for planning permission for things that benefit from permitted development rights. And there are changes of use that are covered by permitted development rights, but I'm not going to touch on that now. I have instead picked out 3 types of permitted development rights among a series of other PD rights that the government has brought forward this summer, again, billed as part of the response to the pandemic and trying to give developers greater flexibility in what they can do with their land and buildings. And this is all about building and building up. I've picked 3 out here. We've got what I've called flats above flats, where on the face of it, you now wouldn't necessarily need planning permission to build up to 2 stories of new dwelling houses above existing blocks of flats. It sounds fairly radical when you say it like that, I suppose. And then we've got various types of upward extension, which I won't read out in full, but there we've got new stories on top of existing houses and new stories on top of existing commercial buildings, for example. And at the bottom there, the demolition of a detached block of flats or or a building in use as an office, that's the old term B1 there, and to be replaced with residential development. Again, on the face of it, quite a radical sounding thing to be able to do without planning permission. And for those who want to look at the references to the relevant bit of legislation that allows all of this to happen, I've put those in. It's the General Permitted Development Order. But I also ask whether or not this is all quite as radical as it sounds. And the reason that I do that is because there is still an element of process that will need to be undertaken in order to actually take the benefit of these PD rights. And that's all a level of detail that's beyond the scope of this webinar. But essentially, there are technical limitations to do with size, number of stories, etc., that would need to be adhered to, and various requirements to get prior approval from the local planning authority for various other elements of what you might be wanting to do. So there is still an element of control in the hands of local planning authorities here, and that exists in relation to the appearance and amenity of certain proposals, and where you're creating new dwelling houses, so creating new residential development, there's a degree of control exercised in relation to wider, for example, traffic impacts, and that all goes to the prior approval process. But interestingly, there doesn't appear to be any limit on the number of new residential units that you might seek to create by taking advantage of these PD rights. So that's something, again, a level of control taken away from the local planning authority. I'll also mention very quickly that permitted development rights can be taken away at the local level by local authorities. They can disapply PD rights by making what are called Article 4 directions. And so that's another example of where, on the face of it, a radical right to do something might exist, but where the local authority nonetheless has the ability to take that away. So there has been some publicity around these PD rights, but when you compare it to everything else that's going on, and given the extra process that you still might need to go through to take the advantage of these particular rights, it's perhaps not quite as radical as some of the other proposed changes to the system. And that is a good segue to hand back over to Pete, who will now talk to us a little bit more about changes to the current planning system.
Thank you, Alex. So Alex has covered limb 1 of my initial slide, which dealt with the changes to the existing system. And now I'm just going to briefly touch on the other 2 limbs, which relate to the government's proposals. So the first, as I said earlier, relates to changes to the current system. This is perhaps best seen as a short-term fix proposed by the government to the existing system before the more radical proposals are brought forward. So this relates to a government consultation which is now closed, and we await the outcome of that consultation. Some of the key proposals included within it relate to the issue of the method for assessing local housing need. Now, why is this important? Well, the method for assessing local housing need is the process by which you start with a figure, it goes into a formula, and out of that comes a figure which is used as the starting point for local authorities to determine the housing in their local authority area through their local plan preparation. So it's a key starting point of that whole process of determining how much housing should come forward in a local authority area. The changes the government are proposing here are intended to better align that calculation, that methodology, with the government's aspirations for delivering 300,000 new homes a year. It also seeks to, in the government's view, better distribute homes and enable more homes to be proposed in areas where they are least affordable. The existing methodology has come under criticism from some parts of the planning industry by leading to artificially low projections, which of course goes against the government's plans for a high level of housing delivery. And so the new proposal aims to remedy that by linking the calculation to other inputs. A second limb proposed as part of this consultation relates to a new affordable housing product called First Homes. The government had introduced this proposal previously, but this consultation looks at introducing policy support for First Homes. A bit about them. Well, First Homes, it is proposed, will be sold at a discount to market price, aimed at first-time buyers. So that discount, it is proposed, is no less than 30%, but maybe in certain areas as much as 50% discount. And the government's ambition is for 25% of all affordable housing secured through developer contributions in Section 106 agreements to be First Homes. So if there is a development proposal coming forward in the future, when these proposals are brought into place, then there would be an expectation that First Homes would form part of the housing proposal for that major development. So that's short term. Now on to the white paper. As I said at the outset, this is the third limb, and the Prime Minister has described this as radical reform unlike anything we have seen since the Second World War. So that just gives you a flavour for how the government see the scale of reform being proposed here. And for that reason, this has been an issue which has hit the mainstream press and has been talked about a lot. There are a significant number of proposals in the white paper, and what I've done here is just pick a very few of them to share with you. Starting with local plans, the government is proposing as part of its consultation for local plans to be greatly simplified and to identify areas of growth, renewal, and protection. And importantly, the government's proposal is that growth areas will receive automatic outline approval on adoption of a local plan. So you can see, rather than going through the process of getting sites allocated and then applying for planning permission, usually for major schemes, an outline planning permission form, and then going through to reserve matters, this would simplify that by, if it came into force, granting outline approval on the adoption of the plan. The second point I've raised there relates to housing numbers. Housing numbers, as I've just mentioned, is a process which currently goes through a standard methodology and then through a local authority process. What the government is proposing here is for that housing number to be handed down by government. So government would tell local authorities what level of housing would be required in their area, and the local authority would then be responsible for planning that housing. Again, a big change to the system being proposed there. A further issue that has sparked a lot of debate is the proposal to replace community infrastructure levy and Section 106 agreements with a new national infrastructure levy. Section 106 agreements and community infrastructure levy at the moment deal with developer contributions arising from development schemes, and also deal with the mitigation of developments through the provision or contribution to things such as schools, open space, community facilities, and infrastructure of different sorts. So the proposal to change that system and introduce a new national infrastructure levy, again, is very significant. So some of these changes, if implemented, as I said, would fundamentally alter the way we in the planning system work. It is a big deal for us. This consultation on the white paper closes shortly, and I expect that we'll receive a response at some stage next year. If the outcome of the consultation is to pursue these proposals, then we would expect the government to bring forward new legislation and significant planning policy changes to back these up. And certainly, hopefully I've given you a flavour for the changes, but you'll see that the significance of these changes is really keeping those of us working in the planning system on our toes at the moment. Thank you very much. That concludes our presentation today, and we now have some time for questions. I have a question here to kick us off, and that is, what happens if the judicial review is successful? And does that mean the changes won't happen? So this is the judicial review challenge I mentioned earlier. So as a reminder, this is the challenge to the statutory instruments bringing forward the changes, some of the key changes that Alex mentioned in his presentation. As I said on my earlier slide, the challenge is brought by a campaign group. And if they're successful, as with any judicial review, the first issue will be for the judge hearing the challenge to decide what remedy to grant. So it doesn't necessarily follow that a successful challenge leads to the outcome that the claimant is seeking. It should be noted that the challenge largely relates to the process undertaken by the government in bringing forward the changes, and the claim relates to what assessments and consultations were and weren't undertaken, and whether they should or shouldn't have been undertaken, and then the extent to which the government then took into account those assessments and consultations. So I say that because it's possible that if the court found in favour of the claimant that no remedy, it's a possible outcome that no remedy would be given, or if a remedy was given and, say for example, the statutory instruments quashed, then what the court is doing is quashing the process, as opposed to saying to the government, you cannot deliver these objectives. So it's entirely possible, if those circumstances were to happen, for the government to bring forward its proposals in a different way. Okay, sorry, a lengthy question there. A second question then, does the government intend to replace all existing housing with first homes? Alex, perhaps you can answer this. Is this an end to affordable rent and other types of affordable housing?
In a word, no, but I think what the First Homes consultation does tell us is that the government continues to be committed to its housing agenda, and that includes building more homes, but it also includes getting more people in a position where they can own their own homes. And the first homes product, if you will, is obviously a route to home ownership. And I think looking at the eligibility criteria of it, it will cast a wider net than some of the existing affordable housing types that allow you to get to home ownership. But the government is only saying that 25%, so a quarter of affordable housing brought forward in new developments should be expected to be first homes. And then the lion's share of the remaining affordable housing that would be expected to be provided in a new development would be, I think the government has sort of two expectations, it sets out two options here. One is that first homes, if they are to replace other types of affordable housing, should seek to replace affordable housing types that get you to ownership first, so to preserve some of the rented products, which typically are there for perhaps more vulnerable people. And so it's not intended that first homes would replace rented products, for example, in that sense. Although I think the other vision that the government sets out in its consultation paper on this is that it might be that if you're not replacing any particular affordable housing products with first homes, that you would get on and deliver the remaining 75% in accordance with whatever your local plan policy says about what types of affordable housing should be delivered. So if it went down that route, then there would be a reduction in the number of affordable rented units, for example, that were being delivered on a site, albeit they wouldn't be being entirely replaced. So it isn't replacing all other types of affordable housing, but it does signal a continued shift towards the idea of home ownership and updating what is meant and understood by affordable housing through policy to achieve that end. It's probably worth mentioning actually that while the eligibility criteria for first homes will be fairly wide, the government is proposing caps on the value of homes that can be sold as first homes, and also caps on the household income of those who might be looking to benefit from first homes. So you wouldn't be expecting to find a wealthy first-time buyer being able to take a very hefty discount on £1 million new property, for example. There are certain caps that are set out for consultation at the moment.
Thank you, Alex. A second question for you, if I may. Going back to use classes orders and changes of use, can a local planning authority just use a planning condition on a new planning permission to prevent all of this?
In many cases, I think that will probably be hard to achieve. In some cases, that probably can happen. And if you look at the guidance that the government puts out on imposing planning conditions, there are some express mentions of this sort of thing, and it is the will of Parliament that this flexibility is given and is used. And so there is an expectation that flexibility should only be taken away if there's a very good reason for doing so, if I can put it like that. So it wouldn't do on the grant of every planning permission that now ever gets granted for there to be a sort of a standard condition that just says simply the use classes order does not apply to this planning permission. That I don't think would be effective in preventing changes of use through the use classes order. A planning condition that was going to effectively restrict the use of the use classes order, as an example, would need to be specifically drawn to describe the particular uses that either were or were not allowed and there would need to be a really good reason for wanting to control that. And where you do see that kind of thing tends to be, you think of sort of out of town business parks or retail parks in particular, where the makeup of the development in terms of who is occupying which units and for what purpose does need to be quite carefully controlled. And that's usually to do with an assessment of retail impact on a town centre, for example. So policy at the moment seeks to protect town centres and the health and viability of shops and other businesses in the town centre. And so only if you can demonstrate that your out of town centre proposal for a large retail park, for example, wouldn't damage the health of the town centre in that way, is your proposal likely to be acceptable from a sort of retail impact, retail planning point of view. There you do often see planning conditions saying that particular units are to be used for particular uses only and not for other uses, and that's backed up with an assessment that's been carried out, which is actually fundamental to the grant of the planning permission for that scheme. But that's both a complicated and quite a niche area to look at in terms of where you would expect to see the use of planning conditions of that type, and the very, the vast majority of planning permissions that are granted in the UK are not for large out of centre retail parks and things with similar impacts. So it's difficult to see that planning authorities can be routinely using a sort of a boilerplate condition to prevent this from happening. And indeed, it is not the government's ambition that planning authorities should routinely be capable of doing that. It would need to be limited to specific circumstances of the type that I just gave in that example. There'll be other scenarios where those types of planning conditions would quite possibly be appropriate as well. But
thanks, Alex. That's great. So for those of you who are interested in planning, things to look out for, the legal challenge I mentioned, it's been heard by the courts and the judgment is awaited. So that's something which will be very interesting to see the outcome of. Secondly, I've referred to two limbs of the presentation, which were government proposals and consultations. So again, I'd recommend keeping an eye out on the responses to those consultations. Thank you. So moving on, just a reminder then for upcoming in-house in focus webinars. We've got 2 dates there for your diaries. Please do look at our website and you'll be able to see the topic areas of those nearer the time. And as I mentioned at the outset, we do welcome your feedback. So on leaving the seminar, please do leave feedback both on this seminar and proposals you'd like in the future. And that just leads me to thank you for listening and attending today. On behalf of myself and Alex, we're grateful, and enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you very much, everyone.